Okay, so let's talk about the Spanish-American War. 1898, relatively short conflict, right? April to December.
That's right. But its impact was huge. Pitted Spain, whose empire was really fading, against the United States, which was, well, definitely on the rise.
And the results were pretty dramatic. The U.S. gained Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines.
Right. And Cuba became a U.S. protectorate, essentially.
Hmm.
It marked the end, really, of Spain's major presence in the Americas and the Pacific.
And the beginning of the U.S. as a global power.
Exactly. But this didn't just happen overnight. You have to look back to the 19th century. Spain's losing its grip. The U.S. is expanding.
And Cuba's right there in the middle of it. They've been a Spanish colony for ages.
Centuries.
Yeah.
And by 1895, Cuban nationalists were in open revolt. Again, it wasn't the first time.
But this time felt different. The Spanish response under Weyler, the butcher.
Ah, Valeriano Weyler. Yes. His reconcentration policy was devastating, forcing civilians into camps. Terrible conditions, disease, starvation. It caused immense suffering.
And it got international attention, didn't it? People were horrified.
Absolutely. Meanwhile, the U.S. is looking south. You've got the Monroe Doctrine basically saying the Americas are the U.S. sphere of influence.
Plus, American businesses had a lot of money tied up in Cuban sugar.
Big time.
Yeah.
And strategically, think about the Panama Canal that wasn't built yet, but the idea was there. Controlling the Caribbean was key.
And the Cubans themselves were pushing for support, weren't they? The Cuba Libre movement. Jose Marti?
Marti was a key figure, a writer, a leader, though he died early in the conflict in '95. But the Cuban junta, their representatives in the U.S., were very active. Propaganda, lobbying, trying to get the U.S. public and government on their side.
Painting this picture of freedom fighters versus a tyrannical empire.
Which wasn't entirely wrong, given Weyler's actions.
Okay, so things are tense. Then comes 1898, the USS Maine.
Right. Sent to Havana in January, officially to protect American citizens and interests during the unrest.
And then, boom, February 15th, the explosion.
Massive explosion. Sinks the ship in the harbor. Over 260 American sailors killed.
And the reaction in the U.S.
Immediate outrage. And you have to factor in the newspapers, Hearst and Pulitzer, the yellow press.
They jumped all over it, didn't they? Sensational headlines, blaming Spain.
Oh, absolutely. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain, became the rallying cry. It just fueled this fire for war.
Even though the cause wasn't clear, the U.S. Navy said an external mine, Spain said an internal explosion.
Exactly. The official U.S. inquiry pointed to a mine. Spain's investigation suggested an internal accident, like a coal bunker fire. Historians still debate it. But honestly, in terms of impact, the perception was what mattered then.
The public wanted action. What about President McKinley? Was he eager for war?
Not initially, no. He actually resisted the pressure for a while, hoping for a diplomatic solution. He tried negotiating with Spain.
But the Maine incident, the public outcry, it just kept building.
It did. And then Senator Redfield Proctor gave this speech after visiting Cuba.
Ah, yes, I remember reading about that. It described the conditions in those camps.
Very vividly. And it apparently swayed a lot of people in Washington who were previously on the fence about intervening. It made the humanitarian argument much stronger.
So diplomacy fails. The U.S. issues an ultimatum.
Basically demanding Spain grant Cuba independence. Spain refused. They cut diplomatic ties.
And then the U.S. blockades Cuba in April.
That was the point of no return, really. Spain saw the blockade as an act of war and declared war on the U.S.
And the U.S. declared war back, but there was that interesting amendment, the Teller Amendment.
Yes, passed alongside the declaration of war. It explicitly stated the U.S. had no intention of annexing Cuba, that it would leave control of the island to its people once peace was restored.
Which is, well, an interesting promise given what happened later.
It reflected a mix of genuine anti-imperialist sentiment and perhaps a desire to assure European powers the U.S. wasn't just on a land grab.
Yeah.
But yeah, the reality turned out more complicated.
So war begins. Two main theaters, right? Pacific and Caribbean.
Let's start with the Pacific, the Philippines. They were already fighting their own revolution against Spain.
So the U.S. wasn't exactly liberating a peaceful colony.
Not at all. Commodore Dewey sails into Manila Bay, May 1st, 1898. Decisive victory. Sinks the Spanish fleet there without losing a single American life in combat.
Wow, that was quick.
Very. Then U.S. ground troops land, cooperate briefly with Filipino revolutionaries led by Emilio Aguinaldo, and Manila falls to the Americans in August.
And Guam.
That was even easier. A U.S. warship showed up in June. The Spanish governor didn't even know war had been declared and surrendered without a fight. Bloodless.
Okay, so the Pacific was relatively swift. What about the Caribbean, Cuba itself?
Much tougher fighting there. U.S. Marines landed at Guantanamo Bay in June, secured a base.
That's the origin of the Guantanamo base we still hear about today.
That's the one. Then the main Army force, the Fifth Corps, landed near Santiago de Cuba.
And there were some tough battles. Las Guasimas.
Las Guasimas was an early skirmish. The big ones came on July 1st around Santiago Battles of El Caney and San Juan Hill.
San Juan Hill, that's the famous one. Theodore Roosevelt and the Rough Riders.
Yes, though it's important to remember the Rough Riders were only part of the force. Regular Army units, including African-American regiments, the Buffalo Soldiers, played a crucial role and took heavy casualties.
It wasn't an easy victory then.
Definitely not. The Spanish were dug in, had good positions, used smokeless powder, which made them harder to spot. The Americans took significant losses climbing those hills. Gatling guns played a big role for the U.S. forces, though.
So they take the heights around Santiago. What about the Spanish fleet trapped in the harbor?
Right. The U.S. Navy had Santiago blockaded. Admiral Cervera, the Spanish commander, was ordered to break out.
How did that go?
Badly. For the Spanish. On July 3rd, they steamed out one by one. The U.S. fleet was waiting and pretty much annihilated them. Systematically destroyed every Spanish ship. Cervera was captured.
So that sealed Cuba's fate, naval-wise.
Absolutely. No hope of reinforcement or escape for the Spanish army in Santiago after that. They surrendered the city on July 17th.
What about Puerto Rico?
That came later in July, after the success in Cuba. The U.S. Navy had already blockaded San Juan. Then General Nelson Miles led a land invasion on July 25th.
Was there much resistance there?
Some battles, yes, but it was a relatively quick campaign compared to Cuba. Spain agreed to an armistice in mid-August, relinquishing Puerto Rico too.
So militarily, a clear U.S. victory, but costly.
Well, costly in a specific way. Combat deaths for the U.S. were actually quite low, maybe around 700 total across all theaters. But disease was rampant. Typhoid fever, yellow fever, malaria, especially in Cuba. Estimates suggest around 15,000 American soldiers died from disease.
15,000 compared to 700 in combat.
Yeah, it's staggering. It highlights the medical and logistical unpreparedness, really. The conditions in the camps were terrible. Far more died from germs and bullets.
A sobering thought. So Spain's defeated in Cuba, the Philippines. They sue for peace.
They had little choice. The Treaty of Paris is signed in December 1898.
And the terms are basically what we discussed earlier. Spain gives up Cuba, cedes Puerto Rico and Guam to the U.S.
And the Philippines. The U.S. actually paid Spain $20 million for the Philippines, which was controversial. Cuba was declared independent, technically.
We'll come back to that technically. What was the fallout in Spain? This must have been a massive blow.
Huge. A national trauma. It led to what's known as the generation of 98 writers, intellectuals trying to figure out what went wrong, Spain's identity, its future.
Did it cripple them economically?
Surprisingly, not immediately. A lot of Spanish capital that had been invested in Cuba actually came back to Spain, providing a bit of a boost. But politically, it weakened the monarchy and shifted Spain's focus towards its remaining colonies, mainly in Africa.
And in the U.S., victory celebrations, I assume.
Yes. But also a huge debate. What do we do with these new territories? Are we an empire now?
The anti-imperialist movement, people like Mark Twain.
Exactly. They argued acquiring colonies went against American ideals of liberty and self-government. But there was also strong public support for expansion, for taking a place among the world powers.
And Theodore Roosevelt becomes a national hero.
Definitely. His charge up San Juan Hill, heavily publicized, launched his political career towards the presidency. It also, interestingly, helped mend some remaining North-South divisions from the Civil War. Veterans from both sides fought together.
What about the African-American soldiers? Did their contribution lead to better treatment back home?
Sadly, not significantly. Despite their bravery and service, the war didn't really change the realities of segregation and discrimination they faced. Though their participation was noted and supported within the Black community, veterans groups also formed, like the VFW.
Now, the territories themselves, what happened in Puerto Rico?
It was put under U.S. military rule initially. Then the Four-Acre Act of 1900 set up a civil government. But crucially, it didn't grant Puerto Ricans full U.S. citizenship or constitutional rights. They were designated citizens of Puerto Rico.
So a sort of limbo status.
Pretty much. The governor and key officials were appointed by the U.S. president. Then you had the Insular Cases Supreme Court decisions that basically said the Constitution doesn't fully follow the flag. These territories were deemed unincorporated.
Meaning they belonged to the U.S. but weren't fully part of it, constitutionally speaking.
You got it. And economically, U.S. interests, particularly in sugar, came to dominate the island's economy. helped by the U.S. tariff system,
Guam.
placed under U.S. Navy administration. Simpler situation initially,
And Cuba. The Teller Amendment promised independence.
but then came the Platt Amendment in 1901. The U.S. pressured Cuba to add it to its new constitution.
And what did that do?
It severely limited Cuban sovereignty. It gave the U.S. the right to intervene in Cuban affairs to preserve independence, life, property, and also granted the U.S. rights to naval bases, most famously Guantanamo Bay.
So, independent, but with major strings attached. A protectorate, really.
That's the word. It defined U.S.-Cuban relations for decades.
Looking back then, what are the big takeaways, the lessons learned from this splendid little war, as it was called?
Well, first, it undeniably marks the U.S. arrival as a major world power, no question.
Yeah.
And conversely, the final decline of the Spanish Empire.
It also really showed the power of public opinion whipped up by the media, didn't it? How that can push a nation towards war.
Absolutely. The role of yellow journalism is a key part of this story. And as we mentioned, the devastating human cost isn't just about battlefields. Disease was the biggest killer by far.
And the aftermath raises all these complex questions about imperialism, self-determination, the responsibilities that come with power.
Exactly. The relationship between the U.S. and these territories, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, even Cuba, became very complicated, and those complexities continue to echo today.
It really set the stage for America's 20th century role.
It did. It was a pivotal moment. Short war, long consequences.
So maybe the final thought for you, the listener, is this. How does understanding this turn-of-the-century conflict, this moment, the U.S. stepped onto the world stage in a new way, shaped how we view America's role and responsibilities in the world now?